we knew that these cases existed. We've had the opportunity to talk about them, but they're often seen as sort of rare and isolated. And in fact, when we brought up these cases in response to proposed personhood measures that would authorize the states to treat fertilized eggs, embryos, and fetuses as if they're entirely separate from the pregnant woman, when we said, look, this is going to be used to arrest women who've had miscarriages and stillbirths. This is going to be used to surveil pregnant women. It's going to do much more than just, as they claim, end the injustice of abortion. And they said, that's just scare tactics. So we said, okay, let's look at what's going on. And what we found when we sought to actually document cases is we found 413 cases between 1973 and 2005. After Roe was decided, we picked that period so we know the outcome of the cases. We know from evidence we got that there were many more of those cases, but we know because sometimes we were advising women who were in South Dakota taken into custody on suspicion of pregnancy to protect the unborn child from her drinking, for example. What we found were their arrests, incarcerations, as you said, in prisons and jails, forced medical interventions. In some of these cases we hadn't heard about, and even surprised us. A case where a woman was diagnosed with gestational diabetes, something that occurs during pregnancy. She didn't comply with the orders for secondary follow-up testing, so they civilly committed her in the hospital. And they said she was examined, she wasn't insane, she wasn't a danger to herself, but because they claimed that her mental health situation didn't enable her to go for needed prenatal testing, they could keep her locked up in the hospital. And one of the things we also found is that when those kinds of things happen, it doesn't mean that the woman or the baby is protected. She was locked in that hospital and they never did the gestational testing. But I think part of what we found, too, as all of this, we sort of talk about it in a language that's very familiar for the last 40 years, Roe v. Wade and the right to abortion, the criminalization of pregnancy. But what we really learned is that what's at stake is the personhood of pregnant women. That when you look at what happened in these cases, women deprived of their physical liberty, the case you mentioned, Angela Carter, deprived of her right to life. They're deprived of due process of law. Women are put in jail and have decisions about forced surgery made in the course of an afternoon. That's basic due process rights. We've had cases where lawyers have been appointed for a fetus before the woman herself who's been locked up ever gets a lawyer. Cases where they've ordered a procedure over women's religious objections. And one court said, pregnant women, of course, have a right to religious freedom unless it interferes with what we believe is best for the fetus or embryo.
Even here in a liberal bastion like New York City, we recently report that more than a dozen city hospitals were routinely testing pregnant women for drugs without informing them about them.
Absolutely. And what we see both in the criminal and civil context is a disproportionate focus for punitive measures on women of color, particularly African American women. We found that this disproportionality included the greater likelihood of felony charges, greater likelihood of the doctor turning in an African American woman. At the same time, we found these cases all over the country and against women of all races. So what we're seeing, and I'll just tell you about
we have 10 seconds.
That we are really talking about not just abortion rights. We are talking not only about reproductive rights, but whether or not in the guise of trying to end just abortion, we are going to remove pregnant women from the community of constitutional persons.